Hello, welcome to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm Chrissy Morgan, and today I am with Peg Wyant, owner of the 28 West 13th Street historic building in the Over the Rhine district in Cincinnati, Ohio. How are you doing today, Peg?
I'm doing great. Good morning, Chrissy.
Good morning. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Tell me a little bit about the building, if you could.
Well, first, can I talk a little bit about Over the Rhine, which is this
I would
neighborhood
love to hear that, yes.
in Cincinnati, Ohio, which has the largest collection, I believe, of 19th century untouched buildings in the country, or among them. And this is one of those buildings. It was built in the late 1800s, about a few years, maybe half a dozen years after Music Hall, which is located across the street. And Music Hall is what anchored this neighborhood. And it was a singer where people came to sing originally, and the Germans, who were the predominant immigrant population of Over the Rhine, hence the name Over the Rhine for the Rhine River.
Oh.
And it was the Rhine River. It was named that because we had a canal here. We built a canal starting in 1820, which is now Central Parkway, and the Germans came to be the workers in the Midwest because of that canal. It was a major transportation hub from the Lake Erie, all the way to the Mississippi, because it connected it. And at any rate, so the Germans came, and they came with their songs, and this was a building that was built, I think, in 1885, I don't know who exactly built it, but it was built as a single-family home originally. The next door house, and it was very narrow. I think it's maybe 12 feet, maybe 15.
Oh.
And so it couldn't be done as apartments in and of itself. The stairway would have taken up most of the interior. So we connected it to the next door building and built it as apartments. And it has 11 apartments in total. And we did that in about 10 years ago.
Oh, interesting.
And the building was built, one of the occupants of the building was the Brand family. And there were 3 or 4 members of that family that rented in this building for several decades, actually. And they were the same people who were founders of the symphony. And the mural there, which features, which was done to honor the 75th anniversary of the Taft Museum, features the music there, Aaron Copland's Ode to a Common Man. And that is the real music. And when they put that there, the people, artworks who did it, did not know that the family who founded the symphony had lived inside. So it was a spiritual happening, I think.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. But it's really lovely, because when you walk out of the opera or the symphony and you see that, it's just very exciting that it's here.
Yeah, you're in a land of music.
Land of music,
yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so in 1885, was the music hall built when this building was built? So it was already existed?
That opened in 1878.
Okay.
So it had been here a few years.
So it brought about the progress.
Yes.
Yeah.
There were various music halls around, but nothing of that stature.
Sure.
And Cincinnati, you may know at that time, was, I believe, the 6th largest city in the United States, and had been made that large, or grew that much, because of the canal.
You were mentioning earlier that there's something about the buildings in this area that remain, and what makes this area a historic area. What do you think is the reason for that?
Well, we were an early city. As I said, we were called the Queen City of the West because this is where people came to go west. And because of the canal, an enormous number of industries started here and were very healthy. And it catapulted this growth of the city. And by the late 19th century, it was a very wealthy city. And a lot of the leaders turned their money or their interest from commerce to the arts. And that explains why Music Hall was built. This art museum started at the same time. We have the 2nd oldest opera company in the United States. We have, I think, the oldest zoo in the United States. And we have one of the earliest symphonies. And so we were highly cultured, highly early on. That said, when the leaders turned their attention to the arts, they didn't want the railroad, for example. They thought, we're big enough, we have a large enough population, and so we're happy to send the railroads to Chicago. So that began a sort of a decline of the city. We grew because of the population of Cincinnati in 1820, when the canal was authorized, when they decided to go ahead with that, was 15,000. 100 years later, the population was 300,000. Very few cities grew that fast.
Wow.
But because Cincinnati leadership wanted to keep us small and cultured, rather than a fast-moving, city, we stagnated. And so we didn't grow, so we didn't tear down things. We didn't have a fire like Chicago. So as the city population declined, and particularly as people moved to the suburbs, places like this just got abandoned.
Yeah.
And so we didn't destroy anything, and we didn't build too much. And so, because they've been built, I think, by the Germans, the buildings stayed. They withstood decades of being abandoned. And so when we did this, the building itself, the structure was intact.
Wow.
Which is pretty exciting.
And rare.
Yes, rare. I mean, Chicago has nothing left because of the fire. New York has nothing left because of expansion.
Right.
So that explains it. So we're lucky.
And in this neighborhood, none of the buildings are more than 6 stories tall. Is that?
That's right. And I think that's because that's as high as you could build them.
Yeah.
Without reinforced concrete, which didn't happen until, the late 1900s or early 1900s, I think. You couldn't build buildings higher.
And then
much higher.
Yeah, and
right.
the neighborhood continues to not have taller buildings.
Correct.
To keep that historic
now we
preservation.
couldn't do it
okay.
because of this has been designated an historic area all over the Rhine by both the National Trust and the City of Cincinnati.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So we're on a parking lot, and if I wanted to build a new building, probably the most I could build it would be 5 or 6 stories high, consistent with the rest of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they would probably like me to build it in brick, since brick is the medium of choice, brick and stone for all these buildings that exist.
Yeah.
And so it's lovely that it's kept that way. It's
Yeah,
really nice.
It definitely is. It definitely is.
Yeah.
When did you acquire the building?
We bought it in, I'd say, 2015, I think, 15, 16. And took 2 years, a year and a half to renovate. And so it's been fully occupied ever since.
Okay. Was it occupied when you bought the building?
Oh, empty, vacant.
Completely empty.
Oh, no, and there was nothing, no one could have lived there.
And what was the neighborhood like?
When I bought my first building over the Rhine, which was 1994, over the Rhine had among the very highest, if not the highest, crime rate in the United States. And so I bought the buildings, the early buildings, because I loved over the Rhine and saw a potential because I'd lived in the East Coast and seen cities like Washington, D.C., which has Georgetown. So I thought, we've got the raw material, but you could not invest at that time and make any money. So I'd buy buildings and I'd sit on them for a couple of years and maybe do a little improvement, but you couldn't be a developer.
Right.
And you couldn't do that at the time. So I would buy and sell and buy and sell. And in 2001 is when you had the riot here, which was not a huge riot as riots go, but sadly a unarmed black man, one street back, was shot, and it did cause, a riot. And we are literally 2 blocks from some of the biggest businesses in the United States, like Kroger and Proctor's, about a half a dozen blocks away. And the business leadership finally, instead of ignoring everything north of the canal/Central Parkway, decided that we've got to do something to fix it. Because it had national prominence. I mean, national, not prominence, but it was nationally written about. And it was a bad thing. And many cities since have had riots, but we were the first one. And it led to the reforming the police, and it led to the city and the government. I mean, the government and the big businesses coming together to fund something called 3CDC, which they put money in, and 3CDC was a non-profit development company that was to help renovate over the Rhine, which is what they did. And I didn't renovate anything until, the first building I did was right next to Music Hall. And that was in 2013. And I did that on city money with 3CDC's help.
Wow,
and
fantastic.
So you needed that big boost in order to be able to do it. And then things, after a few years, started to get better. But all the ones that I have done in Over the Rhine have been with state and federal tax credits, because you needed that extra help in order to fund the development. Otherwise, this neighborhood never would have come back.
Right, and development isn't just the buildings, but the grounds around, and making sure everything is up to code. And
well, that comes with it, yes. Yeah. The historic credits just apply to the buildings, but people do, like the park, for example. Without the park, it wouldn't have happened.
Wow.
Because that you need green space, and so it sort of all does come together.
Yes.
And the city and the big businesses at 3CDC all should be applauded for leading that charge, because it's what brought Cincinnati back.
Well, it's amazing what a green space can do to a community, and how that can change what happens with crime and what happens in the neighborhood.
And people living in it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to have businesses, but you have to have people living.
You don't need to develop every space.
No, but every space is being developed now.
Right.
I mean, it's entirely different now than it was then. I mean, it was hard in the beginning.
What would make you want to keep a building like this instead of knock it down and restore?
I couldn't possibly knock anything down.
No.
Well, because it's beautiful, and it's
agree.
built with a level of craftsmanship that you can't do today. You don't do today. So everything I've ever touched, I started this company in '88, and I started it with, I wrote a strategy, which was that Grandin Properties would buy, develop, and manage best of class buildings in best of class walkable urban neighborhoods. And with the word historic was there too. It was best of class historic
This
urban
was your statement?
neighborhoods. Yes,
I love it, yes.
And pedestrian friendly was not something people used in the 80s.
Right.
I mean, people weren't thinking that way. They were thinking all about the automobile.
Right.
And people don't think all about the automobile anymore. We think about pedestrians, and we think about bikes.
Walkable cities.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we're narrowing streets.
Right.
And changing parking rules and all that.
So that you can talk to your neighbor.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And the other reason, that's a really good point, because the other reason I've always loved this kind of structure is that human beings, I don't believe, were meant to live in glass and steel. You know, there's something not human about that.
Yeah.
Or cold, I shouldn't say not human. But when you live in a 4-story building, you're going to get to know your neighbors, and you're going to talk to people on the street. And if it's a diverse neighborhood, presumably there's going to be less anger, because you can't be angry against people that you've gotten to know.
Yes.
You know, because you typically like people once you get to know them.
Yeah.
So it's a much better way to live. And fortunately, we've done commercial buildings recently, and there's a lot of empty office space nowadays. Well, ours are not empty, and they're not empty because the young people want to be in spaces like that.
Right.
They don't want to be in glass and steel towers.
Right.
You know, it's just too cold.
Connecting to people is becoming more important. Yeah.
Very much so.
Do you know anything about the outside of the building? There's a lot of decoration on this one that is just beautiful. Is it made with tin or wood, or do you know any?
Oh, it's brick and stone.
It's all brick and
it's
stone.
a mansard roof.
Okay.
And all that was pretty typical of the building of that era. And beyond that, I probably shouldn't talk because I'm not an architectural historian. I just know what I like.
I appreciate your honesty on that. How many apartments are in this building?
There are 11.
And that's
in the 2 buildings connected.
In the 2 buildings, and how many were there when it was the one building?
Well, the one was always an apartment, building.
Okay, so it was.
And I guess that was probably the number of units that exist today, which was 6. This was a single family house, and we converted it to 5 units.
Okay. That's amazing to think. And it was the Brand family that had lived there prior.
Yes.
Amazing.
And several members of the family. There were aunts and uncles, and I read about it, and and it was...
So big family in one house.
Big family, and they were all musicians.
Wow, yeah. I can barely imagine that. There's an Italian style on the type of building, and how does that?
Italianate. I honestly should know, but I don't know how to except to describe it as Italianate. But this particularly with the mansard roof, it reflects a French influence. So Italianate and French, and built by the Germans, and that's about as far as I can go.
What is Italianate style? I'm not aware of.
I don't know. Can you help me out? I don't know.
I don't know either. It's pretty.
It is pretty. I just don't know. But I'm sure an architect would.
So tell me, on the interior of the building, what is the stairwell like?
Oh, well, you'll see it, right? So, no, the stairways was just typical of what was one stairway, what was built originally, and then it goes into another one. But it's pretty normal. I don't think there's anything particularly distinguished about it. The hardwood floors were built. We saved them whenever we could.
Oh, that's fantastic.
You couldn't do it in this building, but the neighboring building, we saved those and renovated them. The front of the original windows in the buildings, we replaced only those that were totally...
So when you own a building and you restore, you try to keep what is there
You try
you
to,
can.
and then you have to if you're applying for state and federal credits. They don't let you willy-nilly just destroy things. I mean, you can't take out the, you have to get everything approved.
Yeah.
But if you're an historian, you don't want to take them out anyway.
Right, and a love of the architecture in
right,
general, so
right.
that it makes sense that you appreciate what's
Yeah.
here. And
Right. And there's something about these buildings that I said, my brother, who's an appraiser, said, well, why don't you do strip malls, if you're a
you
developer.
make more money off of
I
them,
know,
right?
you do make more money. I said, because I don't like strip malls. And I like buildings that have a story to tell. And all these buildings have a story to tell.
And here, this one has been now around more than 100 years, and we would like to think it would continue in the future. What's going to happen with our strip
Exactly.
malls where they disappear and no one wants to restore
And
them?
you look at the apartment buildings being built today, and every once in a while one will come up on the market and I'll get notices, and I have no interest because they will not be standing in 50 years.
Yeah.
I mean, they're cheap for starters. You can't afford to build these kind of things today.
Right.
You just can't.
Yeah. What do you see for the future of the neighborhood?
Oh, and just going up and up and up. What's happening on Central Parkway, which is where the canal was, is that's going to be entirely renovated because it was built in the 1920s, and it never was built the way it was supposed to be. So it now has 6 lanes of traffic. It's going to be narrowed to 2. There's going to be very wide pedestrian walkways as well as bike lanes and lots of landscaping. And we have a new soccer stadium. FC Cincinnati is on that. FC Cincinnati is doing their first development is a $300 million multifaceted complex. There's talk of putting the Coliseum on Central Parkway, and Central Parkway is being referred to as the Champs-Élysées of the city because it will be Cincinnati's Grand Boulevard all the way from the Convention Center to Findlay Market, which is 1 linear mile, and it will boast, Music Hall, the stadiums, City Hall, all of these incredible architectural buildings that historical, as well as some of the most exciting new things being done in the city. So that is going to launch another whole era.
So just like in the early 1800s,
Yeah.
continuing the theme of creating culture,
Exactly.
and letting that be the most important thing that keeps people here, keeps the city thriving
Exactly.
throughout the next century.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a bright future here.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much for the conversation, Peg.
Thank you.